Okay, so we can go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, based on where you're joining us from. Thank you all for joining and welcome to today's Norms and Behavioral Change talk. My name is Samira Sayed, and I'm the Managing Director of the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics here at the University of Pennsylvania. We have quite a very compelling set of two talks for you today, starting with a brief talk by an early career researcher, Dr. Joel Ginn from Boston College. And this will be followed by our main talk today by Dr. Jana Freundt from Lucerne University of Applied Sciences and Arts. And after these two talks, we'll have a Q&A segment open to all participants towards the end of today's session. For those of you who might be new to this series or to the center, this is just to share with you that the Norms and Behavioral Change talks are organized by the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics here at Penn, with the support of the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program, and in partnership with the Masters of Behavioral and Decision Sciences program. And the center itself is a research center which provides specialized consulting, research, and training services to organizations throughout the world that are seeking to enact some sort of positive behavioral change. Here, what you can see is the schedule of NoBeC talks that we have lined up through the remainder of 2024. And you can visit our website to register for these future talks. The QR code is at the right-hand side. And something that we'd really like to highlight is that we're organizing a Norms and Behavioral Change conference that's taking place in person here at Penn from October 17th to 19th later this year. And so some further details on this, which we'd like to share with everyone. And we've posted about this on our socials and emailed this out as well. But just for folks to know that in October, we're organizing this Norms and Behavioral Change conference. The theme is on political polarization and democratic norms. And two of our keynote speakers that have already been finalized, they include Dr. Kaushik Basu from Cornell University, and also Dr. Diana Mutz from the Political Science Department here at Penn. And what you can see here at the right is that the QR code at the top is for our call for abstracts, the submissions for which will be due on June 29th of 2024, and further details for the abstracts are going to be on that form. And then just for further details on the overall conference, you'll see here at the bottom, the link and also the QR code for the conference website. So we really look forward to your interest and participation in this. And then just before we get started, a couple of requests. We note that you should automatically be muted, but if not, while the speakers are presenting, if you can just mute yourselves, that would be great. If possible, we'd love for you to keep your cameras on to have a more interactive sort of conversation. And for any questions, please use the chat at any time or raise your hand towards the end of today's session when we have the Q&A. Although I should note that Jana mentioned, if you have questions that come up during her talk, you're welcome to ask them as they come. Last but not least, the recordings of these sessions will be uploaded to our website and our YouTube handle, and the link is as follows. And so with that, we can turn to our first presentation, which is by Dr. Joel Ginn. And just to quickly introduce Joel, he's a postdoctoral researcher in the Social Influence and Social Change Lab at Boston College. He received his PhD in social psychology from the University of Massachusetts Amherst and has primarily focused on environmental action and meat reduction and veganism, examining how social identity and beliefs about the efficacy of individual and systemic actions affect support for and reactions to social movements. And with that, Joel, actually, if you'd like to go ahead and share your screen, that would be great. And also, as you do that, I'll just share with everyone that Joel's presentation today is on the following: honing vegan defaults, extending defaults to promote counter-normative acts, and strengthen default designs through salience. And so with that, Joel, over to you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. As I said, I'm a postdoc at Boston College working with Greg Sparkman, and while the description gave some of my work today, I'm going to be talking about some of the more recent work that we've been doing on vegan default interventions and how we can make default interventions more effective in promoting pro-social behaviors. Now, choice defaults are a type of intervention that shift behavior by making one option the default option among many choices, either explicitly or through the use of display elements. Now, these types of interventions have been shown to be very effective at shifting behavior, with research showing that they can be useful in changing behaviors ranging from something as innocuous as a drink choice into something maybe more impactful like opting into organ donation programs or green energy from utility providers. Now, there are several practical and psychological reasons as to why they work so well. First is that they're not necessarily deliberative, since they are working on the environment in which someone is making a decision that doesn't require any education on their behalf, and they don't limit choice. They don't actually take away any options. Because of this, they can work on people that are operating largely on habit and potentially bypass some reactants that might be elicited from more restrictive appeals. It also intervenes at the time of decision making, operating potentially reducing the intention behavior gap, and because of the nature of this intervention, working at that time of decision making in the choice environment, you don't need to intervene on each individual, and so it's easily scalable. And finally, while these types of interventions, while they change menu designs or decision-making contexts, they're not directly acting on people's perceptions or not giving them a message about norms per se. It can signal some common psychological motivators. People can intuit or perceive things like institutional values, the injunctive and descriptive norms of others who are making these decisions, and the relative ease of each option. But default interventions have often studied behaviors that aren't as subject to public normative influence, often looking at private behaviors or looking at behaviors that sometimes are even already normative. So we wanted to examine if these interventions were effective in shifting public counter-normative behaviors. To do this, we wanted to look at the domain of meat consumption and if it can shift people towards a more plant-based diet. We weren't the first people to think of this. There is a review that came out in 2022 showing that there are already a growing number of papers looking at vegetarian defaults and their potential efficacy. However, this work we thought had some limitations that we wanted to expand upon. Many of these studies looked at online decision-making contexts where they weren't studying actual behavior, and it was only looking at two options, the defaulted and non-defaulted option, without giving people the full richness of dining contexts where they could opt for any number of other types of options. And even these studies that have been done in live dining scenarios look at an explicit meat default as compared to an explicit vegetarian default. And while this shows that there's a difference between the two, it leaves us to wonder if it's due to the removal of an explicit meat default that's causing these behaviors and or the implementation of an actual explicit plant-based default. So in our studies, we wanted to examine how effective a plant-based or vegan default would be in shifting dining choices in college cafeterias. So to do this, we ran a randomized control trial across 3 different university settings over the course of 3 months. In these settings, there was a communal dining hall where one station was randomly assigned on each day to either be a no default control or a vegan default. Under the no default control, 2 versions of the same dish were presented side by side that diners could simply just point to whichever one they wanted. The only difference being whether it was a plant-based version of the same dish or one that had the traditional meat as the protein of choice in the dish. Under the vegan default, only the plant-based version was available, and in terms of what was on display behind the counter. The meat dish was available, and signage indicated as such, but diners had to explicitly ask for it. Now, over the course of these 3 months, we tracked sales data, and what we found was that under the no default kind of business as usual, people opted for meat dishes more often than not. Meat dishes accounted for 73% of total sales. But under the plant-based default, this shifted so that meat dishes accounted only for 42% of the sales. The overall intervention effect, as captured by the interaction between condition and dish type, shows that this was a pretty strong intervention effect, leading to 57% fewer meat dishes served and 58% more plant-based dishes served. So this simply wasn't the case of people leaving or opting for other choices outside of this station. There was actually an increase that is more than likely, as we interpret it, due to people opting into this plant-based dining choice. Now, this did look at only one type of particularly strong default intervention, so we've started to look at some more work to see what types of interventions might be more or less effective. We have this pilot study here with an online university sample where students were presented with 3 versions of a menu, either a no default control, as before, or 2 different types of a vegetarian default that manipulated the salience of the non-defaulted meat option, either listing that as an option directly next to the dish or at the very bottom of a menu, potentially more out of sight to participants. What we found was that compared to a control condition, even a high salience default can still lead to significant shifts in dining behavior, But when you make the alternative option less salient, it drastically shifts behavior towards the defaulted option of plant-based dining here. So from these studies, we've shown that defaults can be quite effective in promoting plant-based dining choices, despite it being a relatively counter-normative behavior. And we've started to look into what alternative default setups might enhance their impacts, looking at salience, but there are other aspects, such as the perceived effort in requesting each type of dish, that might be looked at in future studies. Additionally, these looked at behavior of diners, but there are many psychological and other behavioral impacts that might be resulting from these that we want to examine in follow-up studies, looking at how these are affecting norm perceptions and attitudes towards these dishes, as well as if there's any follow-over or carryover to people's behavior outside of the default setting. We're excited to continue this work, and I'm looking forward to hearing whatever questions people have. Thank you so much for having me today.
Great. Thank you so much, Joel. Really appreciate this presentation, and wanted to say to folks that if you have any questions for Joel, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we will have a Q&A later towards the end. I see a couple of folks like giving some applause for you as well, Joel, but excellent. Let me share my screen once more so we can move along. But yeah, with that, we'll move to today's main talk by Dr. Jana Freundt. And please excuse me for the pronunciation. But to introduce Jana, she's a social scientist with a specialization in behavioral science, and uses experiments and surveys to investigate people's economic and political behavior. She serves as a lecturer and project manager at Lucerne University of Applied Sciences and Arts in Switzerland. And just a note from the center's side as well, that she was previously a postdoctoral fellow with the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics here at Penn from 2018 to 2019. Let me just stop sharing my screen so that Jana, you can go ahead. And as you do that, I'll share with everyone that Jana's talk today is on the following: intrinsic preferences for choice autonomy. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Jana. And thank you so much for joining us. Yeah, no worries at all. Sometimes the buttons can get lost as we start the Zoom. Great, there we go. We can see
Okay, I'm sorry about that.
No worries, no worries.
I had the wrong screen first. Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me, and thanks to everyone for joining us online, and thanks to Joel for the interesting first talk. So this will be a completely different topic. I'd like to present to you some projects I've been working on together with Holger Herz at the University of Fribourg that investigate people's intrinsic preferences for choice autonomy. And let me just jump right into the topic. So the starting point for this whole project and for our experiments is the question: what actually constitutes the value of making autonomous choices? And so one value is relatively obvious, like when you have the possibility to pursue your individual goals, to choose what you want to have, you can basically maximize your utility, right? So this is called the instrumental value component. There's instrumental value to choosing yourself. When I go to the cafeteria, I can buy an oat milk cappuccino. If someone else buys a coffee for me, I don't know what they will choose, right? So there's this value component, but importantly, many people have argued that this is not all, and that there is another value that's inherent to making autonomous own choices, and that's the intrinsic value component. So these people argue that there's a value per se that's inherent to having the right to make own choices that's completely independent of the choice consequences. And so we are not the first to come up with this. Choice autonomy has been studied for a long time, and there are many famous philosophers, psychologists, and social scientists that have argued that choice autonomy is essential for people's well-being, for quality of life, for people's happiness. But in many of these works, the argument that has been put forward is of a consequentialist nature. So here, choice autonomy is seen as a means to pursue individual goals. As I said before, the argument is people can pursue their own best interest if they are free to make their own choices. And so this line of arguing provides an instrumental reason for why individual freedom of choice is valued in individualistic and liberal societies. But there's this complementary view that has been put forward by Amartya Sen and Ata Nussbaum, for example, by some psychologists like Dizzy and Ryan in much of their work. And these authors, they are arguing that autonomy is like a fundamental human need, and it's something that has a value per se that may even be universal. So it's really independent of the outcomes of choice. And so we follow up on this second line of thought, especially because we think that especially in economics, this view has been somehow neglected and it's not that well studied. And one reason that we see is that it's actually quite hard to measure. And that's the gap that we want to address with our studies. So in commonly used measures like survey questions, for example, the world value survey question on perceived control and freedom. In such questions, it's really hard to disentangle these two aspects, right? To make sure that you only measure the instrumental or the intrinsic value component, because usually they're both attached to a choice. And so when you use these kind of questions, you can't really be sure what actually drives the value of choice that like differ between individuals or between institutional environments. And so we address this by proposing a novel preference elicitation tool that we use in large general population samples. And the key innovation here is that we think we are quite successful at isolating this intrinsic value component by fully controlling for any instrumental value of choice autonomy at the individual level. So what I want to do in this talk is that I will present to you the preference elicitation tool that we use in several experimental studies. Then I will show you some results on preferences for choice autonomy and especially on heterogeneity between people. And then I will move a bit further and talk about the role of identity in shaping these preferences for choice autonomy. There are some papers that have addressed closely related questions. Here are a few citations. We also have some more in our working paper that's online, so I don't want to go into details here, but we think that we do something different and that our experimental design differs in important ways from these previous studies. So let me describe to you what we do. So this is the whole experimental design in a nutshell, very briefly. Let me start with the second component. It has two parts, and in the second part, we measure the value of choice autonomy. We do this by eliciting a willingness to pay for choosing a lottery from a choice set C yourself, instead of having another person choose on your behalf. So you have a choice set and you can decide whether you pick yourself or whether you delegate the choice to another participant. So this is relatively simple, but the important part now is what is in this choice set. That's the key question for our design. And what is in this choice set is determined in the first part. And this first part serves the purpose of excluding any instrumental value as an explanation for an expressed preference for autonomy in the second part. So here we let people make a series of choices in order to identify alternatives between which an individual is revealed indifferent. And then we create a choice set that only contains these alternatives. And so the theoretical standard prediction would be, because the utility of an option A equals the utility of the other option B, it doesn't matter to the person whether A or B is chosen. So here in the second part, if you want to choose yourself, it has to be because you derive some intrinsic value from making choice. So this is the main idea. So let me describe it to you a bit in more detail. One important point of this identification strategy is that we really, here in the first part, we really succeed in identifying alternatives between which an individual is revealed indifferent, that really deliver equal utility. And so we need a design where we can gain as much information as possible about the true indifference point of a person, and ideally also about how well we identified it. So we need to also have a measure of our measurement error. And we obtain this by using a structural approach, and more precisely, we use the dynamically optimized sequential experiment. That's an experimental design that has been developed by Stephanie Wang and several co-authors. They use it in different papers. So here are the two main working papers by this set of co-authors. So they invented it and we adapted it to our purpose. And so in our experiment, we use lotteries as alternatives to find a point of indifference. But in principle, you could use this design here with any kinds of consumption goods, with effort tasks whatsoever. We just use the lotteries for convenience in our online setting. And so what happens in part one is that each participant sees her individual sequence of 10 binary choices between two lotteries. There's a fixed lottery A, and then there's a second lottery B that differs between situations. And this sequence that they see, it's path dependent, and it chooses the next lottery dependent on the choices that the individual made. This is what participants see. This is 1 out of 10 choice situations. They always have the lottery A, that's always the same. And then the lottery B here always differs. So this yellow stack of coins, the high payoff, this varies between rounds. And then they can just click A or B. So it's relatively simple. And in the background, we have those that does two things for us. The first is that we obtain the structural estimation of an individual risk preference parameter R. And we want to have this in order to get at the indifference point. And then it also delivers us a structural estimation of an individual consistency parameter, which we would like to have in order to get at the measurement error that we might have for some people. Right, so these are the two main outcomes we would like to obtain in part one of the experiment. And those does this by, using within each round, it selects a next B lottery using an information criterion. We use the Kurbach-Leib criterion, and to select the B lottery that maximizes the information gain over the model, over the preference parameters. So it optimizes within each round, and then between the rounds, we use Bayesian belief updating in order to obtain a posterior distribution of these two parameters at the individual level, so for each individual participant. This is quite abstract and was also quite a short summary. So let me show it to you in a bit more detail by showing you 2 or 3 choice sequences. So here in one panel, you have a choice path by one participant. On the y-axis, you see the rounds, round 1, 2, 3, and so on. And on the x-axis, you see different B lotteries. So these are the high payouts of the B lottery. And so here we have an individual that in round 1 chose lottery B. Then in round 2, they had a B lottery with a lower high payoff. Here they chose A, and then you can see that those kind of zooms in, and then in the third round, it picks another B lottery that's somewhere in the middle between these two to see what the individual chooses here. Then they choose B, and so it kind of zooms in more and more, and sometimes it also goes a little further to the side again, or outside of this area to check basically if the person made a mistake. And so here we have a person that's super highly consistent And we can very precisely estimate the indifference point. It's here at this lottery at 2,190 or something. And then we have someone who makes a small mistake here. And then in the third panel, we have really highly inconsistent person who chooses B in the first two choice situations. Then they switch to A, B, A, and you can kind of see it's all over the place, right? So here we have a person where we can still have an estimate for an indifference point, but it might be quite unreliable because we have quite a large area here of B lotteries where the person just switches back and forth. So we can't really be that sure. But the good thing is that we can identify these people by the estimated choice consistency parameter. So this person has the second lowest consistency score that you can have. And so we can then test whether this matters and how it matters for our elicitation of the willingness to pay for choice. So then we go to the second part. The second part also gives people a sequence of 10 choices where they're confronted with the choice, whether they want to choose themselves or delegate to another subject. And this other subject is always another participant in the study. And this other participant receives a fixed payment that's independent of the choices they make. And this is also communicated to the decision makers. This is what they see. This is the choice screen. Now this is decision situation 1 out of 10. So they see they can either choose themselves or delegate to the other person. So they make a binary choice. Again, they can click off these buttons. And then here in the darker gray box below, they are reminded of the 2 lotteries that are in the choice set. These are these indifference lotteries, right? And then between rounds, what happens is that they see a prize or a bonus they get if they choose themselves. And this price or bonus is again determined by those. So we use basically the same procedure. It's analogous to the first part. We also assume stochastic choice behavior and a utility function. And then we use those to estimate first the value of autonomous choice V and the choice consistency parameter gamma. Okay, so this is the whole procedure of the survey experiment. So the survey experiment always has 3 parts. First, people go through these 10 lottery choices. And from that, we get a pair of indifferent lotteries that are then the choice set for the second part. And in the second part, then people decide whether to choose themselves or to delegate under different prices or bonus payments for choosing themselves. And from this, we get a willingness to pay to choose yourself. And then in the end, we always have a questionnaire. We pay both parts, part 1 and part 2, where we randomly select one of the 10 choice situations to be paid. So the final payoff consists always of part 1 plus part 2 plus a base payment that they always get. There's no feedback or any information until the very end of the survey. And another thing that we do is that we always collect choices of the other participant beforehand on Prolific using the strategy method, just to have them already and to be able to insert them directly into the experiment to avoid like very time-consuming, complicated matching procedure. That always worked pretty well. So let me show you some first results on the existence of preferences for autonomy. So this is the, just look at the left-hand side for a moment. So this is the distribution of the willingness to pay that we measure in part 2 of this experiment when we conducted it on Prolific. These are the results from 2 waves that we conducted in 2021 and 22, where we collected 1,422 observations on Prolific. And here you can see a couple of things. So first, there's this spike at 0, right? So there are always a few people that have a willingness to pay of 0. That means that they don't have a preference to choose themselves. So this would be people who don't have any intrinsic value attached to choice. And then there's a clear majority here on the right hand, on the positive side. So these people all have a positive willingness to pay, so they have a positive intrinsic value of choice. And this is more than half of subjects. But interestingly here, there are also a few people on the other side. There's quite a substantial minority of people who have a negative willingness to pay, meaning that they express an aversion to choosing themselves. So they prefer to delegate and not to choose themselves. And here on the right-hand side, you see exactly the same data, just for the highly consistent people. So this is just for the participants for whom we can be really sure that we very closely identified their indifference point and that we don't have a lot of room for instrumental value that might still be present because we didn't really pick the right lotteries for the choice set in part 2. And here you see that there are a few more zeros, so there are a few more people who have zero willingness to pay, no value for choice autonomy, but there are also more people here on the right side. So actually the average value is even a bit higher for those people. So the average is 76 points for all subjects and 67 points, for all, and 76 points for the highly consistent subjects. In all cases, it's highly significantly larger than zero. And because we make all these structural assumptions in order to, for those in the first part, we can also calculate the fraction of the total expected utility from the choice that the individual faced. This is a stupid sentence, but so we can calculate how large the average intrinsic utility component is in terms of the fraction of the total expected utility of the choice. And in this study here, it was 5.2%. So it's not a large fraction, but I think it's a very realistic share. But as I said before, what I think is really interesting about these results, and this is actually something that we found again and again in lots of different waves that we did on Prolific, is that there's this substantial heterogeneity and it always looks a little bit similar. So we always have more than half of participants, so always a majority who have a positive willingness to pay. It's 53.8% of participants that have a positive willingness to pay. Then we have less than 20% of people who have a willingness to pay of zero. And then we have this quite substantial minority here of people with a negative willingness to pay, meaning they have an aversion to choosing themselves. What can explain this heterogeneity that we observed? Well, first candidate would be maybe sociodemographic characteristics. Overall, I have to say there's not much to see. So we looked at quite a few sociodemographics at Big Five and so on, but none of them really predict preferences for choice autonomy much. The only thing is male. So male participants have on average a higher value for choice than female participants. The distributions are, of course, in the end largely overlapping, but still it's always significant, the difference. So this is the only characteristic that stands out. But otherwise, it seems that these preferences for choice, they are quite evenly distributed across the population. So let's dig further. What we also did after we did our first studies on Prolific is that we took the exact same experiment, exact same setup, and we partnered with a survey firm that had participant panels in many different countries around the world. And so we conducted our experiment in 9 countries using a representative sample. And this is what we found. So this is exactly the same experiment as before, conducted in 9 different countries. And what you can see here without being able to read the details is that there are quite strong differences in the average willingness to pay. So the countries that we have in our sample are Portugal, China, Greece, Italy, France, UK, Sweden, US, and Germany. And the average willingness to pay really differs very substantially. And I think this is a really interesting result, especially since the more individualist and liberal countries here, UK, Sweden, US, maybe Germany if you want, these are countries where actually people's average value for making free, own, autonomous choices is relatively low compared to the Southern European countries and then China here. You can see it here again. Here we displayed the cumulative probability. And so the red line here is Portugal, and the blue one here is China, and then so these have a more higher values of the willingness to pay, and then on the other side you see Germany and the US, where you have more lower values here. But other than that, this heterogeneity pattern that we found before in our sample and prolific, it's actually very similar. So of course the averages move quite a bit, but still we always have this quite substantial minority that has a negative willingness to pay. Then here you can see this jump at 0. So there's this 1/5 or so of the sample that has a willingness to pay of 0. And then you have about half of the sample that has this positive willingness to pay. It shifts, of course. We have these strong differences in the averages, but still this heterogeneity is present everywhere. So to sum up, we can show that preferences for choice autonomy exist across samples, across sociodemographic characteristics, across countries, but we also find substantial individual heterogeneity and preferences for choice autonomy. And we find that it differs quite substantially between countries. So having this result, we of course wanted to move further and understand better what actually determines this value for choice and also differences in how much people value choice. And so let me use the last part of my talk to show you our most recent results on the role of identity. So we started actually from this very small additional experiment that we ran on prolific, where we actually substituted the other participant by just a random draw. So people could not delegate anymore to another participant, but just to a coin flip. Otherwise, it's exactly the same experimental design. And what we find is that while there's still a significantly positive willingness to pay, it drops substantially. So here, this is the average value that I showed you before in our prolific sample of about, I think it was 67 points. When we instead let people delegate to a coin toss, it's about half this value. So it's really a huge difference. So there seems to be something to the person being a human being to which you could, to whom you can delegate. And so this leads to the question whether the value for choice might be driven by the identity of the delegate. And we wanted to investigate this idea further by a follow-up experiment where we set up an experimental design in order to understand better how individuals' willingness to delegate is affected by heterogeneity between the decision maker and the delegate. And so in other words, by whether people share an identity, whether they share a group identity. And it's pretty straightforward that sharing an identity with the person to whom, sorry. So it's pretty straightforward that sharing an identity or being part of the same group of people with the person to whom you can delegate the choice, that this might make you more likely to delegate for instrumental reasons, right? You might trust the other person more, you might think that your preferences are more aligned, But these are all reasons that we exclude in our design, right? Because we exclude any instrumental value. And so the question is, if this is not present, do people still have an intrinsic preference that is shaped by the identity of the person that you can delegate to? If preferences and outcomes or beliefs about the actions of the delegate, they are all excluded. So we asked, so more precisely, we took the dimension of political identity in our first experiment because we think that this is a very salient identity that's very present, that people perceive and actually feel in their everyday lives. And so we asked whether Republicans are intrinsically less averse to delegating decisions when the delegate also identifies as Republican, and the same for Democrats. We again use basically the same experiment with one modification. So in the first part, again, participants make these 10 lottery choices in order to identify an indifference set. But then before the second part with the delegation choices starts, we introduce a treatment. And this treatment informs people about the other participant in this way. So this is a screenshot again from the experiment. And so before the second part starts, we tell them the other participant that you are matched with is a member of the Democratic group or of the Republican group. So this is the only information they get about the other participant. And then when they do the delegation choices again that you have already seen, this is exactly the same screen, right? But we just replace this gray hat with this symbol in order to make it a bit more salient here that this is the identity of the other person. We don't remind them of their own group identity. So this is something we assume they remember, they know, they are aware of. So with this very simple treatment manipulation, we create 4 treatment groups by matching Democratic decision makers with a Democrat or Republican as the other participant, and by matching Republican decision makers with a Democrat or Republican other participants. So we have 2 in-groups, Democrat and Republican, and 2 out-groups, Republican, Democrat, and Democrat Republican. And then, of course, we have to also recruit again 2 baselines without any group framing or any identity framing with the same participants to have a comparison again. This is the main result. What happens here? Let us start with the Republicans. So this is the panel in the middle. Here we have the 3 treatments that Republican decision makers had, either baseline with no framing, in-group treatments where the other participant was also Republican, or the out-group treatment where the other participant was a Democrat. What we can see here is that the in-group and the baseline treatments, they are very highly similar, quite indistinguishable. But in the out-group treatment, the willingness to pay becomes much higher. It's not almost, it's quite exactly twice as high. So Republicans, they show huge out-group discrimination. They are much more averse to delegating when they know that the person they would delegate to is a part of the Democrat group of this experiment. Then here in the right panel, we have the Democratic decision makers. And again, the 3 treatment groups that we had here, baseline with no framing, in-group matched with a Democrat as the other participant, and out-group matched with a Republican as the other participant. And here, first thing we see is that overall, the willingness to pay is lower among Democrats. So the value for making own choices is overall just lower. And the second thing we see is that comparing in-group, out-group, also the willingness to pay doubles on average, but from a much lower level. And then also interestingly, the baseline willingness to pay is much higher than the in-group. So it's somewhere in the middle between the in-group and the out-group. So Democrats, they show a small output discrimination, and they also show some in-group favoritism. And then when we pool it all together and look at all participants together, Republicans and Democrats, this is the overall aggregated result. And here we do see that overall there's outgroup discrimination. So the willingness to pay, the value for making your own choice instead of delegating is much higher in the outgroup treatment when the other participant is not part of your group, doesn't share your identity. And this is, of course, driven strongly by the Republican subjects. Here are some OLS regressions that confirm this result with parametric tests. So the blue coefficients here, they are from OLS regressions where the outgroup treatment was the baseline and the control treatment without framings, they were excluded here. So this is the effect of the in-group treatment, and it's much higher and statistically significant for the group of Republicans. And then also when we pool them all together. And here in the last column, we also included an interaction effect of in-group treatment and Democrat. We see that it's positive. So the in-group effect is smaller for the Democratic group, but this difference is not statistically significant. So overall, we see in our data that the willingness to pay to keep choice autonomy is shaped by a shared political identity. So when the delegate is an outgroup member, the willingness to pay is about twice as high compared to a situation where you can delegate to an in-group member who identifies with the same political party. And this is largely driven by Republican participants who show substantial outgroup discrimination. And we believe that these results have quite important implications for the centralization of decision rights, because if this really holds true, if really independent of differences in preference over outcomes or beliefs about the actions of the delegate and so on, if you really have these differences in the value of choice and in your willingness to delegate decisions to another person, then the centralization of decision rights might face lower acceptance and may therefore be less feasible when individuals do not share the same identity. So if we do actually observe increasingly polarized identities, and it seems to be the case at the moment in not only in the US, actually in other countries too, in European countries as well, then the creation or continuation of political institutions might actually be impeded. And that beyond what you can explain by instrumental reasons. And I think this is a really important possible implication from the results that we observed in our experiment. I talked very fast, so I finished much earlier than I thought I would. So I would already open the floor for questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jana. And now turning to everyone in the audience, please feel free to ask any questions if you might have. We would love to hear from you. Questions for Jana or even from Joel's earlier presentation.
Well, I have two questions. Hi, I'm Catherine Weinberger from University of California, Santa Barbara. The first is whether you were surprised by the relationship between countries and willingness to pay to make their own choices. And I was wondering whether it might not be a difference in preferences, but rather a difference in like marginal returns, because the people in the more liberal countries get to make choices every day, and the other countries, this might be a unique opportunity for them.
Yes. Yes, this is exactly actually what we thought in the end. So we actually selected these 9 countries because they were included in indicators of, by Hofstede, for example, of power difference, of individualism, or in the management decentralization index by Bloom et al. So we had data for these countries on how they are ranked with respect to how individualistic and how hierarchic the organizational structures are in these countries. And so we selected them so that they cover some range, right? So it's kind of a pragmatic choice. And our hypothesis was at the beginning that, of course, people in more individualistic and more liberal societies, they value autonomy more because that's what they learn in their everyday lives, in their culture. But it was the other way around, right? It was exactly a flip of what we expected to observe. And so our exposed explanation was exactly what you just said, that basically your marginal utility from making these choices in the experiment is higher when usually you're not able to make that many choices in your everyday life because they're more restricted. Yeah.
And my other question, if nobody else has one, is about the last study you talked about Republicans and Democrats. I'm curious about whether that varied by gender.
We balanced it with respect to gender.
Mm-hmm.
So we couldn't include it in the regressions. But I think
do the analysis separately for men and for women?
No, I think we didn't actually.
I'd just be curious.
Yeah. No, I think we didn't look at it yet. So this is the most recent study, so we haven't. So yeah, maybe we can look at this because actually we always find these differences in the willingness to pay. So men always have somehow a higher value for a choice. Women have more. There are more women who have a 0 value always. I don't have no idea why, but and that's actually also in most countries. So we looked at it also in the different countries, and it's really across most countries. This is what we find. But we haven't looked at the interaction and with the political identities. So yeah, we could still have a look. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Catherine, for your questions. I see there's another question in the chat, and folks, just to note that please feel free to raise your hand or put any other questions in the chat. There's a question from Claudia who asks, are people aware of the in-group or out-group bias, or is there an intrinsic bias?
I'm not sure. Maybe you can explain what exactly you mean.
Yeah, for sure. Claudia, feel free to, if you want to further expand on that, feel free to, and so Claudia's writing, are they aware of this bias at all, whether it's in-group, out-group, or intrinsic?
But I'm not sure what you mean. Are they aware of the bias? What bias?
Okay.
So are they aware? So they are, no, we don't do that. What we do, well, it doesn't really answer your question, but maybe a little bit. So we have a question at the end where we have one question that asks them how close they feel to the other participant. It's a bit an abstract question in an online experiment, but still we can actually see that this closeness measure, that it differs really between the in-group and the out-group. So there's really still quite a large difference. And this can actually also explain behavior. So this is a bit of a manipulation check, right? So it seems that the treatments, they really manipulated the perceived closeness to the other participant. And this might be a mechanism why you are more willing to delegate.
Great,
but
thanks.
We didn't ask them to justify the choices. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay, thanks, Claudia, for that question. Turning to a few hands that are raised, I saw Christophe first, so please feel free to go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks for both talks. I'm just trying to make sense of them and how they fit together. So on the one hand, we heard how strong the effects of defaults can be, and we see that across the board in different domains. Default effects are one of the strongest choice architecture kind of effects that we observe. But some people might say that defaults actually impact or reduce the autonomy that people have. So on the one hand, we see that people are willing to give up their autonomy by going with the default. And then you're telling us that actually people value autonomy So how do both things fit together? So maybe it's a question to both of you. So how do we kind of consolidate this?
Yeah. Do you want to start, Joel?
I was going to say, like, I was also curious about this, hearing the topic of your presentation, about your interpretation of that. My interpretation of this is the fact that default interventions aren't explicitly taking away an option. Like, they might reduce the salience of it, so people still have that choice. And if they are someone who really wants to have that autonomy, they can express that still. I think it's interesting to see, like, the difference in how much that autonomy matters to different people, which would signify the fact that, like, these interventions might operate differently on different people. So in our studies, for example, we looked at large scale behavior change, but we didn't track individuals and how they were changing. Maybe someone for whom they have a large degree of autonomy is important to them, they might see that they're being, like, interacted upon by this default and think, I don't want to engage with that at all. I'm just going to go somewhere else and express my autonomy by not engaging with this default at all and going somewhere else. But that's, I think, that's my take on it, I would say.
Yeah. So I would also say, I mean, the reason why liberals really like this liberal paternalism approach is exactly because it doesn't take away choices, right? You can still choose. It's just the default. It's not, yeah. But interestingly, so because I'm German, I followed it a few years ago. The government, they wanted to introduce this default option for organ donation. So you have to opt out if you don't want to donate. And this was so controversial. It was really crazy. And they really, in all the discussions, they always refer to this element of free choice, that you should be able to make your own free choice. It was really interesting because you could still make your own free choice, right? But it was really, people seem to have there, you could really see that there seems to be really an emotional and very strong political argument. So it might still be something that's really important in the discussion of the liberal paternalism and default options. But I also have to say that so at least in the US, but also in other countries, we sometimes included questions at the end in our questionnaire. We asked them about their political preferences, also about their attitudes to paternalist intervention. So we didn't ask for soft paternalism, but for like taxation, video surveillance in public areas, stuff like that. But there we never found a really strong correlation to the preferences for autonomy. It seems that these are more driven by elements like trust in the government and stuff like that. Yeah.
Great, thank you for that question, Christoph, and also Joel and Jana for your responses. And I see one more hand raised by Jana. I hope that I'm pronouncing it correctly. Please feel free to go ahead.
You are. Thank you. I've never been on a call with so many other Jana, so that's great. Thank you so much for both your talks. It's really fascinating. I work more on kind of the applied behavioral science side. So I work for Scripps Research. We do digital clinical trials. So just have a kind of a question from a more practitioner's point of view, from the kind of building in options for choice, or for participants to make their own choices in research studies, which we do have. This is something we tend to do for research participants, that we, for example, we have them choose how often they want to hear about, want to hear from a research program, so how often they want to be contacted, things like that. I was wondering if you maybe speak a little bit about how this might be, how we should trade this off between making choices is also effortful for participants. So this is really a flip side that we see, that if we put more decisions to the participants, or we introduce choice, that it can be effortful for people, and that might lead to attrition in a study. So mindful that's not what your paper was about, but I was wondering if you can maybe speak to that a little bit for me as a practitioner.
Yeah, I mean, so my main point was really that it's important to cleanly isolate this intrinsic value and to provide data and empirical evidence on the existence of it, and just to show that it's something that's important, that exists in people, and that you should consider when you talk about organizational structures in firms, for example, or about political decisions, about paternalism and so on. So we haven't tested actually this trade-off that you are talking to. I know that there's a paper by Fabrice Lelec and someone else. I don't remember, but they are a bit more, I think they're speaking a bit more to your question. So they are talking about choice overload, right? That at some point, if you have too many choices, you want to reduce your choice set because it's too effortful and you can't really make a good decision. I think that's a trade-off that's, yeah, probably starts at a different point, right? For each individual, but we haven't tested it, so I can't really tell you how it would look like in the data. But I think it's intuitive that this value, I also think that this value that we estimate for each individual, it's not a constant, right? I mean, it might really differ between, I mean, I showed you that it differs between different decision-making contexts with different identities. It might also depend on the instrumental value, right? I mean, it could be that it increases with the instrumental value that's attached to choice. So saying the more important the choice is, the more you maybe also derive an intrinsic value or not. So I think there are lots of things with which this intrinsic value that we measure that it could vary, but we haven't really identified all of them.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much to both Jana and Jana. So with that, I will say, unless we have any last questions remaining, I don't see any other hands or questions in the chat. So what we can do is we can actually start wrapping up today's session. What I'll do is I'll just share my screen one last time and say to folks that, well, first of all, just wanted to express like deep gratitude to both Jana and Joel for your talks today and contributions to this series. We really do appreciate it, as well as everyone who has joined us today. And this is just to note that for the summer, we're going to have a little bit of a pause in the talk series, and we'll come back as of September 12th with Dr. Kimo Eriksson, who will be continuing us in this Norms and Behavioral Change talk series. And aside from this, just one last reminder that we do have this conference that we're planning for, the Norms and Behavioral Change Conference, which will be taking place from October 17th to 19th here in person at Penn. We would love for you or any colleagues that you know of who work within some sort of research space within the realm of political polarization and democracy or democratic norms, for you to submit an abstract to be considered for either an oral talk or a poster that can be showcased at the conference. And so with that, thank you all again. We greatly appreciate your contributions and presence, and we'll see you soon in a couple of months. Thank you, everyone.